Okay, so then at some point you came back into comics because I started seeing your name on, Red Tornado, who's Superman, Batman Superman, right? So how did that come about?
I had been a filmmaker and visual effects artist for a number of years in LA, and I had wanted to get something back into the comic book field, and ego probably more than anything else. At a certain point, even though we'd had the enormous success I'd had at Valiant, at a certain point I'm going, it's like, wow, it's been like 15 years since I've had anything out. And even though I'd had a wonderful run in film and TV, I thought, well, it'd be kind of nice to write something. And Jimmy Palmiotti's a buddy, and he introduced me to Dan DiDio from DC. Dan's at the time was the executive editor. They didn't have an editor-in-chief title, but that's basically what he was. And I started my pitch saying, it's like, hey, I used to write a comic book called Bloodshot. That was something that was a big book in the 90s, and I'm a filmmaker, and that's about as far as I got before he said, it's like, dude, I read Bloodshot every issue, every month. It was a great comic book, and when you cut that chick in half in Death Row, that was awesome. And I'm like, okay. So I shut up and let him, have the rest of the conversation. And so he was all for it, whatever I wanted to do. It made sense because I'm associated with horror in movies, that he wanted to do something horror-based in comics. So he said, come back and pitch me something. I ended up out in New York. I was working on Law & Order, the TV series, and we had lunch and with Dan and Jan Jones, and we were talking about the kinds of things we wanted to do. And I pitched 2 or 3 things, and they weren't really necessarily something he was excited about. And then I just kind of threw out, I've always had a fascination with the concept of synthetically created vampires and werewolves, meaning made in a lab.
Sure. Okay.
And he got excited about that, and so he said, go, come up with something, give me a real treatment, and by the way, take Superman and Batman and play with them. And I was sure he was going to tell me, stay away from our main characters.
Sure, of course.
And it was the exact opposite. And so right off the bat, I had the 2 big guns. And I originally had created something that I called Carpe Noctem, seize the night, with a K. And their marketing gentleman, Bob Wayne, said, Latin doesn't sell, what's it about? And Dan said, well, it's Superman and Batman versus vampires and werewolves. And he said, well, why don't we call it that? So that's what they did.
It's funny, we've actually commented on that title on our show about how, I don't know what the word George used was, but it was certainly one of the most memorable titles and covers of that year.
Yeah, it's blatantly clear about what it is. Exactly. And I mean, when they first told me, I was like, well, that's a title. Yeah. But to be perfectly honest, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. You knew what it was when you bought it, and it was just a fun title. It wasn't something where I was trying to create the ultimate Batman or Superman book. It was a vehicle to use these iconic characters to introduce these other characters into the DC universe. And it was very successful, and we got to use them again. Tom Mandrake and I did a 5-issue run in Batman Confidential. I introduced zombies at that point, and that was called Batman versus the Undead. And that's how that's been collected as a trade paperback. And so.
Now, you've got a gap of, you said 15 years. What is the biggest difference between Valiant 20 years ago and DC today as far as the working in the company?
I would say the biggest 2 differences. One, when I did the Valiant stuff, we wrote plot first. Okay. So I would describe the action panel by panel, or at least page by page. It would be drawn. It would come back to me as pencils, and then I would script it. And and doing it that way, I have the opportunity to make sure that my dialogue reflects what's being shown in the drawings. Sure. At DC, I write full script. Sure. So if the artist, for whatever reason, chooses not to draw exactly what I wrote or captures the spirit of exactly what I intended, there can be a jarring feeling because the words don't quite match the picture. And there's not really a step in the process for me to go back and fix that. That's one. 2, DC is editorially driven, meaning that more often than not, they may come to you and say, I really need and in my case, an Oracle story. So Barbara Gordon, the chick that was Batgirl, she's now Oracle, but we want to try to do some things to set her on the path to getting her legs back, because she was shot by the Joker in a Killing Joke years ago. So I did a 3-issue story called Oracle the Cure.
Okay.
And again, because I'm a computer geek, that was why that came up. It was because literally they said they wanted to do something with this anti-life equation, and I had thoughts on how to represent data through other means. And in our case, we were dealing with facets of gems and things like that, and decoding these kind of patterns.
Now, so that sort of reminds me of the way Hollywood is run a lot of times, where a producer will sort of hire or treat the writer as his sort of, I don't want to say typist, but that expression has been used in the past. Do you feel that there's too much editorial control at DC, or it's too editorially driven?
No, I'm really not making a value judgment on it. It's just, it's a difference. It's a distinction. To me, as a filmmaker and as a comic book creator, I view two different things. One, I've written screenplays for hire, where I've been hired to adapt a novel, and in that case, it's a commercial job.
Okay.
I have been funded to make my movie, and that's a totally different thing.
Sure.
If you own Batman and you tell me Batman doesn't talk this way or he doesn't do these things, it's your character and you're paying me, and that's fine.
Okay.
But if I have a deal where I have my own characters being published, then I really don't want to change it. I don't have a whole lot of interest in changing it just because you want me to. You know.
And what about the new Valiant relaunch? Have you followed that at all?
Yeah, I have, and I think they've done a really good job. They obviously I like the stuff we did, and I like the fact that I think I would say it's fair to say that tonally there's a similarity to what we were doing. Archer and Armstrong, from what I've read, seems to be very much in keeping with the kinds of things Barry was doing. Barry Windsor-Smith and I both are people who have a strong love of history and myth and rumor and conspiracy theories and all those kinds of things, and that's stuff that Barry established in Archer and Armstrong that they're doing. Their Bloodshot take is different than mine because it sort of takes the idea that my character was more or less a version of a set of memories of his, where obviously I would prefer it to be that mine was the real one and now they go play.
Well, thanks a lot for a very lengthy interview, very informative interview. It was great to meet you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.